The candle flame gutters in the draught, casting wild shadows across glass vessels filled with viscous liquids that seem to pulse with their own internal light. On a stone table in Prague, in the autumn of 1671, an old man's fingers tighten around a crystal the color of fresh blood. His name is lost to history, deliberately erased from records, but the witnesses who found his body 3 days later would speak of him only in whispers for the rest of their lives. His final words, scrawled in mercury across the laboratory floor, read simply, "The red work succeeds, the white work consumes." By morning, the crystal had vanished, and the man's body had turned the color of tarnished silver. What if everything you were taught about alchemy was a lie? Not the lie that it was mere superstition, the fumbling of primitive minds grasping at science they couldn't understand, but a different lie entirely. What if alchemy wasn't pseudoscience, but dangerous knowledge that was deliberately hidden, buried beneath layers of symbol and metaphor, encoded in texts designed to confuse anyone who hadn't been initiated into its deepest secrets? The question seems absurd at first. We've been told the story so many times it feels like truth. Alchemists were simply early chemists, mistaken in their belief that lead could become gold, charming in their naivety, ultimately harmless in their failures. But this comfortable narrative begins to dissolve when you examine what they actually left behind. The bodies, the unexplained deaths, the laboratories sealed by royal decree and never opened again, the experiments that worked once and could never be repeated, the apprentices who went mad, the masters who succeeded and then destroyed their own life's work. In the archives of 17 European cities, there are death records that share a peculiar detail: men and women whose bodies exhibited impossible chemical changes after death. Skin that continued to shift color for hours after the heart stopped. Blood that wouldn't coagulate, or that crystallized into structures that shouldn't exist in nature. Internal organs that appeared to have been transmuted into substances that defied contemporary medical understanding. These weren't isolated incidents across centuries. In some periods, particularly during the height of alchemical practice in the 16th and 17th centuries, they cluster together, connected by networks of correspondence, by shared teachers, by the same forbidden texts. The pattern becomes more disturbing when you trace the lineage of knowledge. Certain manuscripts appear again and again in the inventories of these dead alchemists. The Book of Aquarius, the Emerald Tablet, the mysterious Ripley scrolls with their grotesque imagery of death and rebirth. But here's what's strange: many of these texts still exist, preserved in libraries and private collections. Yet modern chemists who've examined them report finding nothing but gibberish, metaphorical poetry, religious allegory. Either the greatest minds of the Renaissance were engaged in elaborate collective delusion, or these texts were written in a code that requires something more than linguistic skill to decipher. They require practice, dangerous practice. Consider the Philosopher's Stone itself, that legendary substance supposed to transmute base metals into gold and grant immortality to those who consumed it. Every culture that developed sophisticated metallurgy also developed legends of such a material. The Chinese called it the elixir of life. Islamic alchemists knew it as elixir, from which we derive our word elixir. European alchemists described it as a red stone or powder that glowed with its own light. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were all pursuing the same thing, finding the same thing, and paying the same price for it. The price. That's what the official histories always omit. They tell you that alchemists failed to make gold, as if failure was the worst outcome. They don't tell you about the successes that were witnessed, documented by credible observers, and then suppressed. They don't tell you why certain experiments were banned not by the church, but by the alchemists themselves. Why Nicholas Flamel, who allegedly succeeded in creating the stone, spent the last years of his life founding hospitals and churches, as if atoning for something terrible. Why the last known letter of the alchemist Sendivogius contained instructions for destroying his laboratory and burning his notes, instructions that were carefully followed by his heir, even though those notes represented decades of invaluable work. There's a persistent story, surfacing in multiple sources from the 1600s, about an alchemist who demonstrated transmutation before a gathering of natural philosophers in Amsterdam. He took a small quantity of red powder from a vial, added it to molten lead, and produced what witnesses described as genuine gold, later tested and verified by the city's goldsmiths. 3 of the men who witnessed this demonstration attempted to recreate it. All 3 died within the year, their deaths attributed to various causes: apoplexy, fever, accident. But their private papers, later examined, all contain the same phrase, written repeatedly in the margins: "The fire that gives also takes." The alchemist who performed the original demonstration was never seen again. These aren't fairy tales. These are documented historical events involving real people whose lives and deaths are matters of record. What we're going to examine in what follows are the actual experiments, drawn from laboratory notes and correspondence, that survived either by accident or because someone thought them important enough to preserve despite the risks. We're going to look at the strange correlations between ancient alchemical procedures and modern chemistry, the moments where metaphor seems to shade into instruction, where poetry contains practical methodology. We're going to trace the deaths, the patterns of who died and how and what they were working on when it happened. Most importantly, we're going to confront a possibility that modern rationalism has trained us to dismiss, that our ancestors might have discovered something real, something that worked, and something so dangerous that the only responsible act was to hide it behind layers of mysticism and deliberate obfuscation, to encode it in symbols that would seem like nonsense to anyone who approached it purely intellectually, to create a barrier of apparent madness around a terrible. The truth about alchemy may not be that it failed to become chemistry. The truth may be that chemistry is what alchemy became after the dangerous parts were carefully removed. What follows is an examination of what was taken out, and why, and what happened to those who refused to let it go. The evidence is fragmentary, disturbing, and impossible to dismiss once you've seen it. The question isn't whether alchemy was real. The question is what price the alchemists paid for making it so, and whether that knowledge died with them, or merely went into hiding, waiting. In the dim light of a 3rd century Alexandrian workshop, amid the acrid smell of sulfur and mercury, a Greek-Egyptian artisan bent over a crucible containing molten metal. His name has been lost to time, but his obsession would echo through the centuries. He was not merely trying to create wealth. He believed he was attempting to perfect matter itself, to force base metal through a transformation that mirrored the purification of the human soul. This was the birth of alchemy, and it would consume the brightest minds of civilization for the next 1500 years. The origins of alchemy stretch back beyond written memory, into the temple complexes of ancient Egypt, where priests guarded metallurgical secrets as jealously as they protected religious mysteries. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich dark soil of the Nile Delta. That word, Kemet, would eventually give us the term chemistry itself. In those ancient temples, metallurgists discovered that certain rocks, when heated, would weep tears of copper or tin. They learned to combine these metals into bronze, a discovery so valuable it defined an entire age of human development. But more importantly for our story, they noticed something that would obsess alchemists for millennia to come. They saw that matter could be transformed. Egyptian metallurgists observed that dull red ore could become gleaming copper, that sandy rocks could yield silver. If such dramatic transformations were possible, they reasoned, why not others? Why couldn't lead, the heaviest and dullest of metals, be elevated into gold, the most perfect and incorruptible? These weren't idle fantasies. They were logical extrapolations from observable phenomena. The Egyptians had witnessed genuine transmutation. They simply didn't understand the limits. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, Greek philosophical thought merged with Egyptian practical knowledge in the Great Library and Museum of Alexandria. Here, scholars had access to Egyptian technical manuals alongside Greek texts on the 4 elements of earth, water, air, and fire. Philosophers like Zosimos of Panopolis began systematically exploring the theoretical underpinnings of transformation. Zosimos wrote extensively in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, creating some of the earliest alchemical texts that survive. His writings reveal a mind equally devoted to laboratory procedures and spiritual contemplation. He described elaborate apparatus for distillation and sublimation, processes that actually worked for separating and purifying substances. But he also wrote of visions and dreams, of metals suffering and dying before being reborn in purified form. This fusion of practical chemistry and mystical philosophy would define alchemy throughout its history. The alchemists weren't con artists or fools. They were skilled technicians who developed real processes while pursuing impossible goals. And central to their impossible dream was a substance they called the Philosopher's Stone. The stone was never thought to be simply a tool for creating gold, though that was part of its power. According to alchemical theory, the Philosopher's Stone was the perfected essence of matter itself. It was medicine, catalyst, and key to immortality, all bound into one miraculous substance. Alchemists believed that just as the stone could transmute base metals into gold, it could transform the human body from a state of corruption and decay into one of eternal perfection. Small amounts of the stone, dissolved in wine or water, would become the elixir of life. This wasn't symbolic. They meant literal, physical immortality. The logic, within their understanding of nature, was impeccable. Gold never tarnished or corroded. It was eternal and unchanging. The Philosopher's Stone represented the principle that made gold perfect. If that principle could be extracted, concentrated, and applied to the human body, why shouldn't it confer the same incorruptibility? The alchemists saw the universe as fundamentally unified. The same laws that governed metals in the crucible governed blood in the veins. Perfect the one, and you could perfect the other. When the Islamic Golden Age flowered in the 8th and 9th centuries, alchemical knowledge moved eastward and was transformed by brilliant Arabic minds. None was more influential than Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber. Working in Kufa during the late 8th century, Jabir was court alchemist to Harun al-Rashid, the great Abbasid Caliph. Jabir's writings, numbering in the hundreds of works, established alchemical theory on a more systematic foundation. He classified substances into spirits, metals, and compounds. He described specific processes like calcination, dissolution, and coagulation with precise detail that later chemists could replicate. Jabir discovered sulfuric acid, nitric acid, and aqua regia, the mixture of acids that could dissolve even gold. These were genuine advances in chemistry, discovered while pursuing the impossible goal of creating the Philosopher's Stone. His laboratory notebooks describe apparatus and procedures that actually worked. He documented the isolation of antimony and arsenic. He created improved methods for distillation and crystallization. Yet all of this practical knowledge was embedded in a theoretical framework that modern science would consider fantasy. Jabir believed metals grew in the earth like plants, slowly maturing from base forms into gold over geological ages. The alchemist's task was to accelerate this natural process. But Jabir did something else that would define alchemy for centuries. He encoded his knowledge. His texts are filled with allegorical language, symbolic imagery, and deliberate obscurity. He wrote that one must understand the hidden meanings, that the ignorant would be led astray while the worthy would penetrate to the truth. This wasn't mere mysticism. It was intentional gatekeeping. Alchemical knowledge was considered dangerous. In the wrong hands, the ability to create gold would destabilize kingdoms. The secret of immortality could upset the divine order. So alchemists developed elaborate codes. They wrote of a green lion devouring the sun, of a king and queen uniting in a chemical wedding, of a black crow giving way to a white swan. Each symbol had specific meaning to the initiate. The green lion was vitriol. The sun was gold. The black crow represented the stage of putrefaction, when materials turned dark and seemed to die. But outsiders reading these texts would find only impenetrable gibberish. Manuscripts were illustrated with bizarre images of dragons, hermaphrodites, and cosmic trees. The alchemists created an entire symbolic language that allowed them to share knowledge among themselves while excluding the uninitiated. In medieval Europe, alchemy became even more secretive. The Catholic Church viewed it with suspicion, seeing in it hints of heresy and forbidden knowledge. Kings and nobles, desperate for gold to finance wars and palaces, would imprison alchemists and demand they produce wealth. Working under these pressures, alchemical guilds formed in major cities, operating in shadows and meeting in secret. Members took oaths of silence. Knowledge was passed from master to apprentice in locked laboratories, where furnaces burned day and night. The most famous of these medieval alchemists was Nicolas Flamel, a Parisian scrivener who lived in the 14th and 15th centuries. According to the stories that grew around him, Flamel purchased a mysterious book of alchemical secrets from a desperate stranger. The book, bound in copper and filled with arcane symbols, was attributed to Abraham the Jew, supposedly an ancient master of the art. Flamel spent decades trying to decode the book's secrets. He traveled to Spain to consult with Jewish scholars who might understand the Hebrew inscriptions. He experimented endlessly in a laboratory beneath his house on the Rue de Marivaudot. Then, according to legend, on a January day in 1382, Flamel succeeded. He created the Philosopher's Stone and used it to transmute half a pound of mercury into pure gold. More significantly, he and his wife Perenelle were said to have drunk the elixir of life. They would never die. The evidence cited for this claim was circumstantial but compelling to believers. Flamel and his wife, despite being relatively poor scribes, suddenly began donating vast sums to charity. They funded the building of hospitals and churches throughout Paris. Where did this wealth come from? Clearly, believers said, from transmuted gold. But here's what makes Flamel's story fascinating from a historical perspective. Nicolas Flamel was a real person. He really was a scrivener in 14th century Paris. He and his wife really did donate significant money to charitable works. The houses he endowed still stand. We have records of his business transactions. So we have a real historical figure around whom legends of alchemical success accreted. Whether Flamel actually practiced alchemy is unknown. The books attributed to him were likely written centuries after his death. But the legend persisted because people wanted to believe it was possible. The romantic ending to Flamel's story claims he and Perenelle faked their deaths and continue to live in secret to this day. Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries claimed Flamel had been spotted at the opera in Paris, unchanged from his medieval appearance. These sightings obviously tell us nothing about Flamel, but everything about the enduring power of alchemical dreams. What's crucial to understand is that medieval alchemists like Flamel, whether the legends about him were true or not, developed real chemical knowledge. They discovered phosphorus, isolated zinc, created new acids and compounds. They perfected distillation, invented laboratory equipment still used today. The alembic, the retort, the water bath, these are alchemical inventions. They learned to separate alcohol from fermented liquids, creating spirits strong enough to burn. They discovered that certain substances, when heated, would glow in the dark. They documented hundreds of chemical reactions with meticulous care. Their laboratory notebooks reveal patient, systematic experimenters. They recorded temperatures, quantities, colors, smells, and textures. They repeated experiments dozens of times, varying conditions to observe results. This was genuine scientific methodology, even if the theoretical framework was wrong. They weren't charlatans pretending to turn lead into gold. They were skilled technicians who believed, based on the best theories available to them, that such transmutation was possible. The tragedy and triumph of alchemy lies in this paradox. The alchemists failed completely at their stated goal. No one ever created the Philosopher's Stone. No one achieved immortality or transmuted lead into gold. But in pursuing these impossible dreams, they invented chemistry. They developed the apparatus, techniques, and empirical methods that would eventually become modern science. The secretive guilds, the coded manuscripts, the obsessive pursuit of perfection. All of this created a tradition of careful experimentation and knowledge preservation. When science finally emerged from alchemy's shadow in the 17th century, it inherited 1,500 years of accumulated practical knowledge. The ancient dream born in Egyptian temples and refined in Alexandrian workshops never died. It transformed, as the alchemists believed matter could transform into something new. In the dimly lit laboratories of medieval and Renaissance Europe, a silent killer waited in every crucible, every alembic, every carefully heated retort. The alchemists who labored in these cramped, smoke-filled chambers sought nothing less than the transformation of base metals into gold, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, and perhaps even immortality itself. But the very substance they believed held the key to these miraculous transformations was slowly, methodically destroying their minds and bodies from within. Mercury, the peculiar liquid metal that flows like water yet weighs heavy as lead, became the obsession of countless seekers after hidden knowledge. The ancient text called it quicksilver, argentum vivum, the living silver. Alchemists across centuries believed mercury to be the prima materia, the first matter from which all other metals were born. If one could perfect mercury, purify it through endless cycles of heating, cooling, distilling, and recombining, perhaps it would reveal the secret of metallic transmutation. Perhaps it would yield the red powder, the mysterious substance that could turn lead into gold with just a touch. So they heated it. Day after day, year after year, they subjected mercury to flame. They watched it vaporize into silvery fumes that caught the lamplight and seemed to dance with an almost supernatural beauty. They inhaled those fumes with every breath, absorbed the vapor through their lungs, felt the tiny droplets settle on their skin and hair. They had no concept of what those shimmering vapors were doing to them, no understanding of how mercury crosses the blood-brain barrier and accumulates in the nervous system, wreaking havoc that compounds with each exposure. The symptoms came gradually, so slowly that most alchemists failed to connect their deteriorating condition with their sacred work. It began with tremors, slight at first, barely noticeable, a quiver in the hands while writing, a shake that made pouring liquids from one vessel to another increasingly difficult. The condition grew worse over months and years, until some alchemists could barely hold their tools, their hands possessed by a palsy that made every movement a struggle. Then came the changes in the mouth. The gums would become inflamed, swollen, bleeding at the slightest touch. Teeth loosened in their sockets and eventually fell out. The breath took on a metallic taste that never went away, a constant reminder of the quicksilver that now pervaded every cell of the body. Excessive salivation plagued many practitioners, their mouths producing streams of liquid that they had to constantly spit or swallow. But the physical symptoms, terrible as they were, paled in comparison to what mercury did to the mind. This is where the true horror of alchemical practice revealed itself, in the slow unraveling of reason and personality that afflicted those who spent years breathing toxic vapors in pursuit of impossible dreams. The psychological transformation often began with irritability and mood swings. Alchemists known for patience and contemplative temperaments became suddenly prone to outbursts of rage over trivial matters. They grew suspicious of colleagues, convinced that others were stealing their discoveries or deliberately sabotaging their experiments. This paranoia deepened over time, expanding to encompass wider circles of imagined enemies and conspiracies. Then came the visions. Alchemists throughout history recorded experiences of profound mystical revelation, moments when the secrets of nature seemed to unfold before their eyes in cascades of symbolic imagery. They saw spiritual beings, encountered angelic presences, witnessed the very structure of reality revealing itself through complex geometries and living symbols. These visions were often described in language of religious ecstasy, treated as genuine contact with divine wisdom, or the anima mundi, the world soul itself. But medical science now recognizes these experiences for what they truly were. The visions followed predictable patterns. Visual distortions came first, with objects seeming to shimmer or move at the edges of vision. Colors became more intense, almost painfully vivid. Then came fully formed hallucinations, ranging from simple geometric patterns to elaborate scenarios that seemed utterly real to the experiencer. Many alchemists interpreted these symptoms as signs they were approaching success, that their work was bringing them closer to spiritual transformation. The trembling hands were seen as evidence of divine energy flowing through the body. The metallic taste was proof that their very flesh was being transmuted. The visions were revelations from higher planes of existence. In tragic irony, the poison that was killing them became validation of their theories, encouragement to continue their fatal work. The case of Johann Conrad Dippel provides a particularly well-documented example of an alchemist's descent into Mercury Madness. Born in 1673 at Castle Frankenstein near Darmstadt, Germany, Dippel was a man of formidable intellect who studied theology, philosophy, and alchemy with equal passion. His early career showed great promise, with published theological works that attracted attention across Protestant Europe. But Dipple became increasingly obsessed with alchemy and what he called the production of the elixir of life. He established a laboratory where he worked with mercury and other toxic substances, attempting to discover the secret of immortality itself. His neighbors complained of terrible stenches emanating from his workspace, the smell of sulfur and burned metals, the acrid bite of chemicals heated to extreme temperatures. Contemporary accounts describe Dipple's gradual transformation. Where once he had been sociable and engaging in debate, he became reclusive and hostile to visitors. His writings grew increasingly paranoid and grandiose, filled with claims of great discoveries that he insisted others were trying to steal. He became convinced that powerful forces were aligned against him, that his work threatened established powers who wished to keep humanity ignorant and enslaved. His hands developed a pronounced tremor that made his once neat handwriting deteriorate into an almost illegible scrawl. His letters from this period show the physical struggle, with ink blots and crossed-out words where his shaking hands betrayed him. He complained of persistent pain in his joints and teeth, of a metallic taste that haunted him constantly. Most disturbing were the changes in his personality. Dipple became convinced he had discovered the secret of transferring souls between bodies, that he could achieve immortality, not through the Philosopher's Stone, but through a kind of spiritual transmigration. He made claims that frightened those around him, hints that he had performed experiments that went far beyond accepted bounds. Some historians believe these claims were pure delusion, the mercury-poisoned fantasies of a deteriorating mind. Others wonder if there might have been terrible truth in his boasts, if his madness had led him to acts better left unrecorded. He died in 1734, at the age of 61, found collapsed in his laboratory surrounded by his equipment. The official cause of death was listed as a stroke, but those who knew him suspected the years of exposure to toxic substances had finally claimed their toll. His laboratory was cleared by workers who complained of feeling dizzy and nauseated from the vapors that still lingered in the closed space, testimony to the poisonous atmosphere in which Dipple had spent his final years. The pattern repeated across centuries and cultures. Isaac Newton, perhaps the greatest scientific mind in history, also fell victim to Mercury's insidious poison. His alchemical experiments, conducted in secret and only partially revealed through his coded notebooks, involved extensive work with mercury. In 1693, Newton suffered what his contemporaries described as a nervous breakdown. He became paranoid, wrote strange accusatory letters to friends, suffered from insomnia and loss of appetite. His behavior was so erratic that some feared for his sanity. Modern analysis of Newton's hair samples has revealed mercury levels 40 times higher than normal, clear evidence of chronic exposure. The great mind that revealed the laws of gravity and motion had been compromised by the very substance he believed might unlock deeper mysteries. Newton eventually recovered, pulling back from his alchemical work and focusing instead on his mathematical and astronomical studies. But he was fortunate. Many others never recovered at all. The tragedy deepens when we consider that alchemists often recognized something was wrong, but misidentified the source. They knew their work was dangerous. They documented the symptoms affecting themselves and their colleagues, but they attributed the effects to the spiritual dangers of their quest, to demonic interference, or to their own unworthiness to handle such powerful forces. The idea that the mercury itself was poisoning them seemed impossible. How could the prima materia, the fundamental substance of transformation, be harmful? It would be like suspecting the air itself of being toxic. So they continued, generation after generation, filling their lungs with metallic vapors, watching their hands shake, feeling their minds slip away from them by degrees. They recorded their visions in elaborate manuscripts, describing the revelations that came to them in their laboratories. Angels appeared and spoke the secret names of metals. The stages of the great work revealed themselves in symbolic form. The universe opened itself to their mercury-saturated consciousness and seemed to make sense in ways it never had before. But these were not revelations. They were symptoms. The hallucinations, the grandiose delusions, the sense of profound cosmic insight, all were the predictable effects of a brain slowly being destroyed by accumulated heavy metal. The mystical experiences that seemed to validate the alchemical worldview were actually evidence of the danger inherent in that very practice. The laboratory conditions these practitioners endured would horrify any modern safety inspector. The rooms were small, poorly ventilated, often windowless or with only tiny openings for light. Alchemists believed secrecy was essential, so they worked in basements and hidden chambers where no curious eyes might witness their experiments. This meant the toxic vapors had nowhere to go. They hung in the air, concentrated in the confined space, breathed and rebreathed hour after hour. The furnaces burned constantly, keeping crucibles at temperatures that would vaporize mercury and other metals. The heat itself was oppressive, made worse by the heavy leather aprons and gloves practitioners wore. Sweat, mixed with metallic dust, created a paste that adhered to skin and worked its way into pores. Mercury droplets scattered on workbenches and floors would vaporize slowly over time, maintaining a constant background level of contamination. The practitioners themselves often noted feeling worse during extended periods of work, but attributed this to the spiritual strain of their efforts, or to malign influences that had to be overcome through prayer and purification. The idea of taking breaks, of working in well-ventilated spaces, of limiting exposure, never occurred to them. Their texts emphasized constancy, the importance of maintaining operations for days or weeks without interruption. The Philosopher's Stone, they believed, could only be achieved through unwavering dedication, through willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of the great work. And sacrifice they did, though not in the way they imagined. They sacrificed their health, their sanity, sometimes their lives, all in pursuit of a goal that was chemically impossible. The transmutation of lead into gold cannot be achieved through chemical means, no matter how much mercury one heats or how many times one repeats the process. But they had no way of knowing this, no framework for understanding atomic structure or elemental immutability. To them, the failure of each experiment was simply evidence they had not yet perfected the process, that more work was needed, more heating, more distillation, more time spent breathing poison in sealed chambers. The saddest aspect may be that some alchemists, in their final days of clarity before madness overtook them completely, seemed to recognize what had happened. Brief letters survive, moments of lucidity where a practitioner acknowledges the price paid for forbidden knowledge. But even then, many expressed no regret, insisting the visions and insights gained were worth whatever cost in health or sanity. The mercury had so thoroughly distorted their judgment that they could not see their tragedy for what it was: a preventable poisoning, a slow death by toxic obsession, years of life traded for hallucinations and shaking hands. The young emperor's lips were stained red with cinnabar as he lay dying in his palace chamber, his body convulsing from the very substance his court alchemists had promised would grant him eternal life. This scene repeated itself across more than a millennium of Chinese imperial history, as emperor after emperor consumed deadly concoctions of mercury, lead, and arsenic in their desperate quest to escape mortality. The irony was not lost on the court officials who watched their rulers waste away, their skin taking on a metallic sheen, their minds unraveling, their bodies slowly shutting down from the very pills meant to preserve them forever. The story begins with Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China in 221 before the Common Era. He was a man who accomplished what had seemed impossible, bringing the warring states under one rule, standardizing currency and writing, building the foundations of what would become the Great Wall. But unifying an empire was not enough for Qin Shi Huang. He became consumed by a more ambitious goal, one that no military conquest could achieve. He wanted to live forever. Contemporary records describe how the emperor dispatched expeditions of hundreds of young men and women to mythical islands in the Eastern Sea, searching for the fabled elixir of immortality. When these expeditions failed to return with the magical potion, Qin Shi Huang turned to a more scientific approach. He summoned the most learned alchemists in his realm, men who claimed to understand the secrets of transformation, who promised they could distill the essence of eternal life from earthly material. The alchemists told the emperor that mercury, that strange liquid metal that pooled and scattered at the slightest touch, held the key to immortality. They explained that because mercury could transition between solid and liquid states, it embodied the principle of transformation and renewal. The substance never seemed to decay or tarnish. To their minds, mercury was already immortal, and consuming it would transfer that immortality to whoever ingested it. Historical texts recovered from the period reveal the specific recipes these court alchemists employed. They would combine mercury with sulfur through a process of repeated heating and cooling, creating cinnabar, that brilliant red compound the ancient Chinese associated with life force and vitality. They added jade powder, believing the stone's durability would strengthen the body. Lead compounds were mixed in, along with realgar, an arsenic sulfide that gave off a vibrant orange hue. Some recipes called for gold dust, for what could be more incorruptible than gold. Others included ground pearls, dried herbs, and the shells of rare tortoises, animals known for their longevity. The pills were crafted through elaborate rituals, involving precise timing, according to celestial movements. Alchemists would begin preparation during specific lunar phases, heating their crucibles to exact temperatures, chanting incantations they believed would imbue the mixtures with spiritual potency. The final products were small, dense pellets, often coated in gold leaf, presented to the emperor in jade boxes on silk cushions. They looked like treasures. They were, in fact, poison. What these ancient alchemists did not understand was the devastating neurological and physiological effects of heavy metal poisoning. Mercury accumulates in the body's tissues, particularly the brain and kidneys. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, where it interferes with neural transmission, causes cellular death, and triggers a cascade of symptoms from tremors to personality changes to complete cognitive collapse. Lead attacks the nervous system, the blood, and the gastrointestinal tract. Arsenic compounds interfere with cellular metabolism at the most fundamental level, preventing cells from producing the energy they need to function. The emperor began his regimen of immortality pills in his middle years, taking them daily as his alchemists prescribed. At first he reported feeling vigorous, energized. This initial effect was real. Mercury poisoning in its early stages can create a feeling of stimulation, even euphoria. But within months, the true effects began to manifest. Court records describe how Qin Shi Huang became increasingly paranoid and erratic. He ordered purges of officials he believed were plotting against him. His temper, always formidable, became explosive and unpredictable. He suffered from tremors in his hands and had difficulty walking. By his late 40s, the emperor was in steep decline. His skin took on a grayish pallor. His breath smelled metallic. He experienced episodes of confusion where he would forget where he was or fail to recognize longtime advisors. Yet even as his health deteriorated, he increased his consumption of the immortality pills, convinced that he simply had not taken enough for the transformation to complete itself. The alchemists, desperate to keep their own heads attached to their shoulders, assured him that these symptoms were signs that the elixir was working, that his body was being purified and transformed. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 before the Common Era, while on a tour of his empire's eastern territories. He was only 49 years old, relatively young even by ancient standards for someone of his wealth and privilege. The official cause of death was recorded vaguely as illness, but modern analysis of his symptoms points clearly to acute mercury poisoning as the culprit. The very pills he took to escape death had hastened it by decades. One might think this catastrophic result would have ended the practice of consuming immortality, elixirs. Instead, the next 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history saw emperor after emperor repeat Qin Shi Huang's fatal mistake. The Tang dynasty, which ruled from the 6th through the 10th centuries of the Common Era, lost more emperors to elixir poisoning than any other period. At least 6 Tang emperors are documented to have died directly from consuming alchemical preparations. Emperor Xianzong, who ruled in the early 9th century, became obsessed with Taoist alchemy after years on the throne. He established entire palace departments dedicated to producing immortality pills, staffed by dozens of alchemists working in specially constructed laboratories. The recipes they followed had grown even more complex and toxic over the centuries. One recovered formula from this period called for mercury that had been heated and cooled 81 times, combined with lead oxide, sulfur, arsenic trisulfide, gold dust, and ground minerals including malachite and cinnabar. This concoction was then mixed with honey and formed into pills to be taken 3 times daily. Emperor Xianzong took his pills faithfully for several years. Court observers recorded a dramatic personality change. The once capable administrator became irritable and suspicious. He suffered from insomnia and would wander the palace at night, convinced that spirits were speaking to him. His hands shook so badly that he could no longer write. Near the end, his skin became so sensitive that wearing clothing caused him agony. He died in 820 at the age of 43, his internal organs essentially melted by the accumulation of heavy metals in his system. The alchemists who had prepared his pills faced execution. But here emerges one of the most chilling aspects of this recurring tragedy. The execution of failed alchemists did nothing to stop the practice, or even slow it. New alchemists immediately stepped forward to take their place, each convinced that they had the correct formula, that their understanding of the cosmic principles was more refined than their executed predecessors. Some genuinely believed in their work. Others simply could not refuse the emperor's command without facing immediate execution anyway. At least if they agreed to produce the pills, they had time, imperial patronage, and the slim chance that the emperor might die from other causes before the poison took full effect. This created a perverse system of incentives. Alchemists were under enormous political pressure to produce results. An emperor demanding immortality pills was not making a request that could be politely declined. The alchemists faced a choice between certain death, now through refusal, or possible death later if the pills proved fatal. Given that choice, they chose later. They convinced themselves that perhaps this time, with these specific ingredients, at this particular cosmic alignment, the formula would actually work. Emperor Wuzong, who ruled in the mid-9th century, took this obsession to new extremes. He consumed immortality pills in such quantities that his urine reportedly turned black and his hair fell out in clumps. Palace records describe how his behavior became so erratic that officials were afraid to approach him. He would issue contradictory orders within hours, fly into rages over imagined slights, and spend days in his chambers talking to people no one else could see. When he died in 846 at the age of 32, his body was so saturated with mercury that court physicians noted his flesh had an unusual sheen to it, reflecting light like polished metal. His successor, Emperor Xuanzang, witnessed all of this and reportedly vowed never to touch immortality pills. He kept that vow for nearly a decade. But as he aged and his health naturally declined, he found himself surrounded by alchemists who had survived the previous reign by lying low. They presented themselves with new formulas, refined techniques, safer preparations. They appealed to his vanity, his fear of death, his desire to complete the great works he had begun. Slowly, they wore down his resistance. Within a few years, he too was consuming daily doses of mercury and lead. He died in 859, another victim of the quest for eternal life. The chemical composition of these pills virtually guaranteed their lethality. Mercury alone is catastrophically toxic. When combined with lead, the effects multiply. Both metals accumulate in soft tissues. Both cross into the brain. Both cause kidney failure, digestive breakdown, and immune system collapse. The addition of arsenic compounds added another layer of cellular destruction. Modern toxicologists who have analyzed the recipes found in Tang Dynasty texts describe them as essentially optimized poison delivery systems. Every ingredient chosen worked synergistically with the others to maximize destructive potential. Yet the alchemists had created an elaborate theoretical framework that explained why these dangerous substances should promote health. They drew on Taoist principles of balance and transformation, on concepts of yin and yang, on theories about how minerals formed in the earth over eons, and thus contained condensed time that could be released in the human body. To them, mercury's ability to amalgamate with gold was proof of its transformative power. Lead's weight and density suggested permanence and stability. These were not random choices but selections based on a coherent, if ultimately incorrect, understanding of nature. The pressure to continue this work came not just from emperors but from the entire imperial system. Court officials needed to believe that their emperor could transcend normal human limitations. The ideology of the mandate of heaven suggested that the emperor was semi-divine, touched by celestial power. If he could become literally immortal, it would confirm the righteousness of his rule and the cosmic approval of his dynasty. Alchemists who questioned the safety of their own products were questioning the fundamental legitimacy of imperial authority. This created an environment where truth became subordinate to political necessity. Even as emperors died with clear symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, official records attributed their deaths to sudden illness, exhaustion from governing, or the will of heaven. The pills themselves were never officially blamed. To do so would be to admit that the imperial court had been feeding poison to the Son of Heaven, an impossible admission that would undermine the entire governmental structure. The deadly irony at the heart of this practice extended beyond simple paradox. These emperors wielded absolute power over millions of subjects. They commanded armies, directed the construction of monuments, shaped laws and culture. Yet, this very power became the trap that killed them. They could not be told no. They could not be protected from their own desires. The same authority that let them reshape nations left them vulnerable to charlatans and their own delusions of transcending mortality. In seeking to become more than human, they died more pitifully than common people who never consumed a single grain of mercury. The practice finally declined not because anyone proved the pills were dangerous, but because dynasties changed and new rulers came from different philosophical traditions. By the time the Song dynasty rose to power in the 10th century, imperial attention had shifted away from alchemical immortality toward other pursuits. But even then, the knowledge and recipes persisted, passed down through Daoist monasteries and private collections, waiting for the next desperate soul willing to trade a long life for the promise of forever. The winter mist clung to the spires of Prague Castle in the year 1611, as Emperor Rudolf II stood before a sealed door in the eastern wing of his palace. Behind that door lay his greatest secret, a laboratory that had consumed 2 decades of his reign, countless fortunes in gold, and perhaps something far more precious. Within hours, his men would brick up the entrance entirely, entombing whatever remained inside. The emperor's hands trembled as he touched the cold iron, but whether from age, illness, or fear, no witness could say for certain. Rudolf had not always been the haunted, reclusive figure who now wandered the corridors of Hradčany Castle, like a ghost in his own domain. When he moved his imperial court from Vienna to Prague in 1583, he arrived with grand visions of transforming the city into the intellectual center of Europe. But Rudolf's interests extended far beyond conventional scholarship. While other monarchs concerned themselves with territorial expansion and political marriages, the emperor became obsessed with penetrating the deepest mysteries of nature itself. He sought nothing less than the keys to creation, to transmutation, to life and death themselves. The emperor gathered them from across the continent. Alchemists, astrologers, natural philosophers, and practitioners of the hermetic arts answered his summons, drawn by promises of unlimited resources and protection from the increasingly suspicious eyes of the church. They came from England and Italy, from the German states and the Low Countries, each bearing their own secrets and ambitions. Edward Kelly arrived from England with his ears cropped for counterfeiting, claiming to possess the legendary red powder that could turn base metals to gold. Michael Meyer came from the German territories with his theories of musical alchemy, believing that certain harmonies could catalyze transformation. Oswald Kroll brought his medical alchemy, convinced that the same principles that turned lead to gold could transmute disease into health. Rudolf housed his most favored practitioners in the Golden Lane, a narrow street of small, colorful houses built into the arches of the castle walls. The popular legend that these were the quarters of the court alchemists has been disputed by some historians, but recent archaeological evidence suggests the truth lies somewhere between folklore and fact. These modest dwellings served as both homes and laboratories, each equipped according to the specific needs of its occupant. The emperor visited them frequently, often in the dead of night, desperate to witness the great work in progress. What exactly transpired in those laboratories has been a matter of speculation for 4 centuries, but the physical evidence tells a darker story than the romantic legend suggests. When archaeologists excavated the Golden Lane in 1952, and again in 2002, they discovered remnants that painted a disturbing picture. Beneath the floors of several houses, they found elaborate furnace systems far more sophisticated than simple goldsmithing would require. Chemical residues on ceramic vessels revealed experiments with mercury, lead, arsenic, antimony, and stranger compounds whose purpose remains unclear. Most unsettling were the glass vessels of unusual design, flask-like containers with multiple chambers and spiral channels etched with symbols from Hermetic texts. The alchemists' notebooks that survived Rudolf's reign describe experiments that pushed the boundaries of credibility. They wrote of the creation of homunculi, tiny artificial humans supposedly grown in glass vessels from human seed, horse dung, and a complex regimen of heating and cooling over 40 days. The formula appears repeatedly in multiple sources from Rudolf's court, described with the clinical precision of a chemical recipe. Whether they truly attempted such creations, or used the homunculus as a metaphor for some other process, remains one of the great mysteries. But the laboratory equipment found in those excavations included vessels that match precisely the descriptions for these experiments, complete with residues of organic compounds and minerals in combinations that serve no conventional purpose. Then there were the deaths, a procession of them that followed Rudolf's alchemical obsession like a shadow. They began slowly, almost unremarkably. An assistant poisoned by mercury fumes. A practitioner found dead in his laboratory after an explosion. These could be explained as the natural hazards of working with volatile substances in an age before proper safety measures. But as the years progressed, the deaths became stranger and more troubling. In 1597, the alchemist Bavorodovsky the Younger was found dead in his laboratory under circumstances that defied explanation. His body bore no marks of violence, yet witnesses reported that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. More disturbing, every glass vessel in his laboratory had shattered simultaneously, though no one heard any sound of breaking. The chemical mixtures he had been working with had seemingly vanished, leaving behind only stains of colors that observers struggled to describe, hues that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The case of Edward Kelly stands as perhaps the most suspicious of all. The English alchemist had enjoyed a complex relationship with the emperor, alternating between favor and imprisonment as Rudolf's patience waxed and waned with the failure to produce the promised gold. In November of 1597, Kelly was imprisoned in the castle of Most, tasked with producing gold or facing execution. According to the official account, he attempted escape in November of 1598, fell from a window, and died from his injuries. But several contemporary sources tell a different story. A letter from Kelly's wife claims that her husband was already gravely ill before his supposed escape attempt, suffering from mysterious symptoms that included bleeding from the eyes and violent convulsions. A guard at the castle reported seeing Kelly the night before his death, describing the alchemist as lucid and calm, showing no signs of desperation that would prompt an escape attempt. Most intriguing is a partially burned document discovered centuries later in the Prague archives, a fragment of what appears to be a report to Rudolf. The legible portions describe Kelly achieving a breakthrough in his experiments, something involving crystalline structures that exhibited properties the writer calls impossible and unnatural. The document ends mid-sentence, and Kelly was dead within a week. Other alchemists simply vanished. In 1603, 3 practitioners working collaboratively on what they termed the Great Conjunction disappeared from their shared laboratory in a single night. The laboratory was found locked from the inside, undisturbed except for a circle of what appeared to be ash on the floor, though chemical analysis showed it was not the residue of any known combustion. Their belongings remained, their notes lay open on their tables, but the men themselves were never seen again. Rudolf ordered the laboratory sealed and forbade anyone from speaking of the incident. The emperor's own writings, fragmentary and often cryptic, suggest he knew more than he ever revealed publicly. In a letter to his physician, he wrote of seeing things that should not exist, of his alchemists opening doors that were meant to remain closed. He described waking from nightmares in which the boundaries between matter and spirit had dissolved, leaving only a terrible luminescence that consumed everything it touched. Whether these were the ravings of a man descending into madness or the testimony of someone who had witnessed genuine horrors remains a matter of interpretation. By 1611, Rudolf's power had crumbled, his empire fragmenting as his obsessions consumed him. His brother Matthias forced him to abdicate most of his authority, leaving Rudolf as emperor in name but stripped of real power. It was during this period that Rudolf made his final visits to the laboratories. Witnesses reported that he emerged from one such visit pale and shaking, immediately ordering the laboratory permanently sealed. He died within a year, his final words reportedly a warning that some knowledge should remain buried. When the sealed laboratory was finally opened in the 20th century, archaeologists found a space frozen in time. The furnaces were cold, the vessels arranged as if work had stopped mid-process. But what captured attention was a large glass container in the center of the room, a complex apparatus unlike anything else discovered at the site. The vessel had clearly contained some liquid or solution, now long evaporated, but the residue defied easy analysis. Chemical tests revealed trace amounts of gold, silver, mercury, and organic compounds, but also elements and isotopic ratios that seemed inconsistent with 17th century materials. Most puzzling was a crystalline deposit at the bottom of the vessel, a substance that appeared to shift between solid and liquid states depending on ambient temperature and light exposure in ways that contradicted known physics. The archaeological team documented strange effects while working in that laboratory. Instruments malfunctioned without explanation. Photographs developed with inexplicable distortions. Several team members reported vivid dreams of standing in the laboratory while it was active, watching shadowy figures work at furnaces that glowed with light that hurt to perceive. One researcher insisted she could hear whispered Latin phrases when the room was completely silent, though recording equipment captured nothing. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery behind a loose stone in the laboratory wall. Someone had hidden a small journal there, its pages filled with cramped handwriting in a mix of Latin and German. The entries were undated and unsigned, but the writer described achieving what he called the final stage, a process that would crown all the years of work. The writing became increasingly agitated, describing something growing in the vessel, something that should not be possible. The final entry reads simply, "We have succeeded. God forgive us, we have succeeded. May this knowledge die with us." Today, the Golden Lane welcomes tourists who wander through the colorful houses, now converted into museums and shops. Guides tell sanitized stories of medieval alchemists searching for gold, of romantic mysticism and quaint superstition. They rarely mention the deaths, the disappearances, or the sealed laboratories. The archaeological finds remain in climate-controlled storage, studied occasionally but never fully explained. The crystalline substance from the central vessel exists in a specialized containment facility, its properties still defying complete understanding 4 centuries later. And sometimes, on winter nights, when mist wraps around the castle, those who work late in the archives claim they can hear sounds from behind the bricked-up walls, like glass gently chiming against glass, like whispers in languages that have been dead for centuries, like something that was created long ago still moving in the darkness, waiting. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of The Hague in late 1666, when a stranger appeared at the door of Dr. Johann Friedrich Schweitzer. The physician, known throughout the Dutch Republic by his Latinized name Helvetius, had earned a reputation as a man of science and reason, personal physician to the Prince of Orange himself. He was not given to flights of fancy or superstitious belief. Yet what transpired over the course of the next several weeks would shake his skepticism to its very foundations and leave behind questions that remain unanswered more than 3 centuries later. The stranger was unremarkable in appearance, dressed in the simple cloak of a craftsman or merchant, his face neither young nor old, neither handsome nor ugly. He gave no name, offered no credentials, and yet spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who possessed knowledge that others desperately sought. He had come, he said, to demonstrate something that most learned men considered impossible. He claimed to possess the Philosopher's Stone, that legendary substance alchemists had pursued for generations, the powder that could transmute base metals into gold. Schweitzer's initial reaction was precisely what one would expect from a man of his education and standing. He laughed, not cruelly, but with the weary amusement of someone who had heard such claims before. The pursuit of alchemical gold was, to his mind, the province of charlatans and dreamers, men who wasted fortunes and lifetimes chasing an impossibility. He had studied the natural philosophy of his age, understood the principles of matter and substance as they were then known. The transmutation of metals was contrary to everything he had learned. The stranger seemed neither offended nor surprised by Schweitzer's skepticism. From within his cloak, he produced a small ivory box. Opening it with careful reverence, he revealed a powder of the most extraordinary color. Schweitzer would later describe it in his written account as resembling saffron in hue, but possessing a peculiar luster, a quality of light that seemed almost to emanate from within the grains themselves. The substance was heavier than it appeared, the stranger explained, and so powerful that a single grain, no larger than a seed of wheat, could transform an entire ingot of lead into the purest gold. Schweitzer, despite his doubts, felt his curiosity stirring. He asked if he might examine the powder more closely, perhaps take a sample for analysis. The stranger refused, but not before allowing the physician to look upon it, to observe its peculiar properties. The powder seemed to shift in color as it caught the light, now deep crimson, now pale yellow, now something between the two that had no proper name in the vocabulary of colors. Before departing, the mysterious visitor made a promise. He would return in 3 weeks' time, he said, and on that occasion, he would provide Schweitzer with a small portion of the powder. The physician could then test its properties himself, satisfy his skepticism with direct observation. With that, the stranger disappeared back into the crowded streets of The Hague, leaving Schweitzer alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of unease that he could not quite explain. The weeks passed slowly. Schweitzer found himself thinking of the stranger and his impossible powder more often than he cared to admit. He mentioned the encounter to colleagues, framing it as an amusing anecdote, another example of the delusions that plagued those who pursued alchemical dreams. Yet privately, he found himself hoping the stranger would keep his word and return. True to his promise, the visitor appeared again precisely 3 weeks later. This time, his manner was more urgent, his visit brief. He produced the ivory box once more, and using a small instrument, extracted a fragment of the red powder no larger than a grain of rapeseed. It was, Schweitzer thought, disappointingly small, hardly enough for any meaningful experiment. Reading the physician's expression, the stranger assured him that even this minuscule amount would prove sufficient if used correctly. But there was a crucial instruction. The powder must first be wrapped in wax before being cast into the molten lead. Without this protective coating, the intense heat would cause the powder to disperse, its virtue lost before the transmutation could occur. Schweitzer pressed the stranger for more information. Who was he? Where had he obtained this miraculous substance? How was it prepared? The visitor smiled enigmatically and declined to answer. He had shared what was necessary, he said, and nothing more. Then, as before, he vanished into the city, and this time he would never be seen again. Despite Schweitzer's later efforts to locate him, to discover his identity or whereabouts, the stranger had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed at all. For several days, Schweitzer kept the powder locked away, uncertain what to do with it. His skepticism warred with his curiosity. Finally, he decided to attempt the experiment, but he would do so properly, with witnesses present who could attest to what occurred. He was a man of reputation, after all, and if he was to make claims about transmutation, he would need credible observers who could verify every step of the process. He invited several trusted individuals to his laboratory, men of education and social standing whose word could not easily be dismissed. Among them were members of the local nobility, fellow physicians, and scholars. He explained what he intended to do, showed them the tiny grain of red powder, and made clear his own doubts about the likely outcome. The laboratory was prepared with meticulous care. A crucible was set up for melting lead. Schweitzer obtained a quantity of ordinary lead, the sort used for common purposes, making certain it was examined by his witnesses beforehand. There could be no suggestion that gold had been hidden within the lead itself. The metal was confirmed to be nothing but base lead, with all the properties and appearance one would expect. As the lead melted in the crucible, Schweitzer prepared the powder. Following the stranger's instructions, he wrapped the minuscule grain in a small ball of wax. His hands, he would later write, trembled slightly as he did so. Whether from excitement or nervousness or simple uncertainty, he could not say. When the lead had fully liquefied, glowing with intense heat, Schweitzer dropped the wax-wrapped powder into the crucible. What happened next would become the subject of his detailed written testimony and the sworn statements of everyone present that day. The molten lead began to change. At first, the transformation was subtle, a shifting in color, a change in the way the light reflected from its surface. But within moments, the change became unmistakable. The dull gray of lead gave way to a brilliant yellow gleam. The substance in the crucible was transforming before their eyes. The witnesses crowded closer, transfixed by what they were seeing. Schweitzer stirred the molten metal with an iron rod, ensuring it mixed thoroughly. The transformation continued, spreading throughout the entire mass. When he finally poured the liquid into a mold and allowed it to cool, what emerged was a metal that possessed every characteristic of gold. It had the weight of gold, the color of gold, the luster of gold. It could be hammered and shaped like gold. When tested with the methods available at the time, including assaying and acid tests, it responded exactly as gold should respond. The amount of gold produced was substantial, far exceeding the tiny size of the powder grain that had caused the transformation. By Schweitzer's calculation, that single particle, barely visible to the naked eye, had converted approximately 4 ounces of lead into pure gold. The ratio seemed impossible, defying any reasonable explanation. Yet, there the gold sat, solid and real, witnessed by multiple observers who could hardly believe what they had seen. Schweitzer had the gold tested by local goldsmiths and assayers, professionals whose expertise lay in determining the purity and authenticity of precious metals. Each confirmed what Schweitzer's own tests had shown. The metal was genuine gold of exceptional quality, purer than most gold found in nature or produced by conventional refining methods. Word of the experiment spread quickly through The Hague and beyond. Schweitzer, ever mindful of his reputation, wrote a detailed account of the entire affair, publishing it in 1667 under the title The Golden Calf. In it, he described every aspect of his encounters with the stranger, the properties of the powder, the experiment itself, and the results. He included the testimony of his witnesses and invited any who doubted his account to examine the gold for themselves or to speak with those who had been present. The account created a sensation. Here was no desperate alchemist making wild claims in obscurity, but a respected physician, a man of science and social standing, documenting an event that multiple credible witnesses had observed. The story reached the attention of scholars and natural philosophers across Europe. Some dismissed it as elaborate fraud or delusion. Others saw in it confirmation of alchemical principles. Still others simply did not know what to make of it. But the mystery deepened with every attempt to explain what had occurred. The stranger who provided the powder was never identified, never found, never heard from again. Without him, there was no way to obtain more of the substance, no way to study its composition or method of preparation. The powder used in Schweitzer's experiment had been completely consumed in the process, transformed entirely in the transmutation. No trace remained for analysis, no residue that could be examined by later investigators. Modern researchers, looking back on Schweitzer's account with the tools and knowledge of contemporary chemistry, have struggled to explain what actually happened in that laboratory in The Hague. Some have suggested that the gold was already present, perhaps concealed within the wax, or introduced through sleight of hand, though this requires assuming that Schweitzer and all his witnesses were either deceived or complicit in deception. Others have proposed that the lead itself was contaminated with gold, though the amounts involved would have required contamination far beyond what could plausibly go undetected by period testing methods. Chemical analysis of similar historical claims has occasionally revealed clever tricks involving gold salts or amalgams, substances that could give the appearance of transmutation when subjected to heat. But these explanations struggle to account for the specific details of Schweitzer's report: the witnesses, the testing methods employed, the purity of the resulting gold, and perhaps most tellingly, the physician's own reputation, and the fact that he had nothing obvious to gain and much to lose by fabricating such a story. The case remains, even now, stubbornly resistant to simple explanation. Either Johann Friedrich Schweitzer and his witnesses experienced something that violated the fundamental principles of chemistry as we understand them, or the events of that day in 1666 were the result of an extraordinarily sophisticated deception that has defied centuries of scrutiny and investigation. The stranger's identity, his motives, and the true nature of his red powder remain unknown, locked away in the past beyond the reach of modern inquiry, leaving us with only questions and the unsettling possibility that some mysteries resist all attempts at resolution. The official history tells us that alchemy died sometime in the 18th century, replaced by the rational discipline of modern chemistry. The alchemists hung up their robes, abandoned their crucibles, and joined the march of scientific progress. But this comfortable narrative conceals a more troubling truth. The quest to transmute base metals into gold never truly ended. It simply went underground, continuing in secret laboratories throughout the 20th century and beyond, driven by the same ancient obsessions that consumed medieval practitioners. In the shadowed corners of modern science, alchemical research persisted with a quiet intensity that would have surprised those who believed the old art was dead. These weren't crackpots or charlatans, though plenty of those existed. These were trained chemists, physicists, and researchers who became convinced that the ancients possessed knowledge that had been lost or deliberately concealed. They worked in private laboratories, published under pseudonyms, and guarded their discoveries with paranoid secrecy. Some achieved legitimate scientific breakthroughs. Others vanished under mysterious circumstances, their research notes destroyed or seized by unknown parties. The most enigmatic figure in this modern alchemical underground emerged in 1920s France. Known only as Fulcanelli, this mysterious alchemist published two extraordinary books that would captivate generations of researchers. The Mystery of the Cathedrals appeared in 1926, followed by Dwellings of the Philosophers in 1930. Both texts claimed that Gothic cathedrals contained encoded alchemical secrets, hidden in plain sight within their architecture and sculptures. But it was the author himself who became the greatest mystery of all. No one knows Fulcanelli's true identity. Numerous candidates have been proposed over the decades. Some believe he was a French chemist named Pierre Dujon-Stadi. Others point to physicist Jean-Julien Champagne-Dore. The most intriguing theory suggests Fulcanelli was actually a woman operating in a male-dominated field, perhaps explaining the need for absolute anonymity. His publisher and supposed student, Eugene Cancelliet, claimed to have witnessed Fulcanelli successfully transmute lead into gold in 1922. According to Cancelliet's account, the transmutation occurred in a gasworks laboratory, producing roughly 100 grams of pure gold from lead using a mysterious powder. Cancelliet described watching the metal transform, its color shifting from gray to brilliant yellow as the temperature rose. But the story grows stranger still. Cancelliet claimed he met his teacher one final time in 1954 in Spain. By this account, Fulcanelli had discovered the secret of extreme longevity, one of alchemy's ultimate goals. He appeared decades younger than he should have been. After this meeting, Fulcanelli disappeared completely, leaving behind only his cryptic texts and unanswered questions. To this day, no one has definitively proven who Fulcanelli was, or whether the transmutation Cancelliet witnessed actually occurred. The mystery endures, neither confirmed nor debunked, hovering in that uncomfortable space between possible truth and elaborate hoax. While Fulcanelli worked in secrecy, mainstream science was inadvertently achieving the alchemist's dream through entirely different means. In 1919, Ernest Rutherford successfully transmuted nitrogen into oxygen by bombarding it with alpha particle. It was the first artificial transmutation of one element into another, accomplished not through mystical processes but through nuclear physics. This was followed by more dramatic demonstrations. By the 1940s, particle accelerators could transform mercury into gold, precisely the transmutation alchemists had sought for centuries. The irony was profound and bitter. Transmutation was real. The ancient dream was achievable, but the costs made it utterly worthless for the purpose alchemists had always intended. Creating gold through particle bombardment required enormous amounts of energy, sophisticated equipment, and produced only microscopic quantities. The gold created this way cost millions of times more than naturally mined gold. Nuclear transmutation proved that the alchemists had been chasing a theoretically possible goal, but one that violated every principle of economics and practical chemistry. It was like discovering you could turn lead into gold, but only by first burning through $10 million worth of platinum and electricity for every gram produced. Yet even this economic impossibility didn't stop the obsession. Some researchers became convinced that alchemical texts contained clues to cheaper, room temperature transmutation methods. They believed the ancients had discovered catalytic processes or quantum effects that modern science had overlooked. Throughout the mid-20th century, a small but dedicated community of scientists began studying medieval alchemical manuscripts with fresh eyes, searching for lost chemical knowledge hidden beneath layers of symbolic language. These weren't all fringe researchers. Some held positions at respected institutions. They approached alchemical texts as encoded chemistry, attempting to translate symbolic descriptions into modern chemical operations. When an alchemical text described the philosophical mercury combining with philosophical sulfur, these researchers tried to determine what real chemical substances and processes might be represented. Some discovered interesting reactions that had been forgotten by mainstream chemistry. Others found descriptions that seemed to anticipate later discoveries, suggesting the alchemists had stumbled upon genuine chemical phenomena, even if they lacked the theoretical framework to properly understand them. But the darkest chapter in modern alchemy was only beginning. In the final decades of the 20th century, and continuing into the 21st, reports began emerging of classified experiments conducted in private laboratory. These weren't university research projects subject to peer review. These were secretive operations funded by wealthy individuals, conducted by small teams bound by non-disclosure agreements. The focus of these experiments allegedly went beyond simple transmutation. According to leaked reports and whistleblower accounts, researchers were investigating alchemical principles at the quantum level, exploring connections between consciousness and matter that traditional science dismissed as impossible. The details that emerged were deeply unsettling. One facility in Switzerland allegedly experienced a containment breach in 2007 during an experiment attempting to replicate an alchemical process described in a 16th century manuscript. 3 researchers were exposed to an unknown substance. 2 died within weeks of respiratory failure. The third survived but reportedly exhibited bizarre physiological changes that medical experts couldn't explain. Tissue samples showed cellular structures that appeared to be in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously alive and necrotic. The official cause of death was listed as chemical poisoning, but the specific chemical was never identified. Similar incidents were reported elsewhere, though details remained frustratingly vague. A private laboratory in California shut down abruptly in 2012 after neighbors reported strange lights and a humming sound emanating from the facility. When investigators finally gained access, they found equipment dismantled and all research materials removed. Scorch marks on the floor and walls suggested intense heat, but there was no evidence of fire. One room's temperature measured 15 degrees colder than the surrounding environment, and remained that way for 6 months before gradually normalizing. No explanation was ever provided. In 2015, a chemist named Dr. Marcus Reinhardt died under mysterious circumstances in his private laboratory in Germany. Reinhardt had published several papers on historical alchemy and was known to be conducting private experiments. His colleagues described him as brilliant, but increasingly obsessed with a particular medieval text he claimed contained instructions for a process modern chemistry couldn't explain. When his body was discovered, the scene baffled investigators. The laboratory showed no signs of fire, explosion, or chemical spill. Yet Reinhardt's body was found partially transmuted, his skeletal structure chemically altered in ways that shouldn't have been possible without extreme heat and pressure. One arm had become a substance that was neither bone nor metal, but possessed properties of both. The autopsy report was sealed, and the case was quietly closed without a public explanation. These incidents share troubling commonalities. They involve researchers working with historical alchemical texts. They produce chemical reactions or physical transformations that defy current scientific understanding. They result in deaths that cannot be adequately explained by conventional chemistry or physics, and they are invariably followed by official secrecy, with research materials confiscated and details suppressed. Some researchers in this field have spoken cautiously about their experiences, always careful to avoid specifics that might identify their work or employers. They describe encountering chemical reactions that seem to violate thermodynamic principles, materials that exhibit properties that change based on observation, and transformations that appear to involve quantum effects at the macro scale. One chemist, speaking anonymously, claimed that certain alchemical processes only work when performed by someone in a specific mental state, suggesting a connection between consciousness and chemical transformation that materialist science cannot accommodate. The implications are profoundly disturbing. Either these reports are fabrications and coincidences, or something genuinely anomalous is occurring in private laboratories around the world. If the latter, it suggests that alchemical texts might contain genuine knowledge that modern science has dismissed too hastily. It implies that the boundary between chemistry and what we might call magic is more permeable than we believe. Most troubling of all, it means that researchers are dying in pursuit of this knowledge, their deaths unexplained and their discoveries potentially lost. The modern alchemical underground exists in the gaps between mainstream science and fringe research, between public knowledge and classified information. It's populated by brilliant minds who became convinced that ancient practitioners discovered something real, something that couldn't be fully replicated by modern methods because the theoretical framework was wrong. These contemporary alchemists work in isolation, sharing information only with trusted colleagues, aware that mainstream academia would destroy their careers if their research became public. The ultimate question remains unanswered. Were the ancient alchemists entirely wrong, pursuing impossible transmutations through symbolic thinking and mystical philosophy? Or did they stumble upon genuine phenomena that modern science, in its rush to dismiss alchemy as primitive pseudoscience, has overlooked? The mysterious deaths and unexplained reactions occurring in modern laboratories suggest we may not know as much as we think. The alchemical quest never ended. It only changed form, adapting to new tools and new theories while maintaining its ancient obsessions. And in laboratories we cannot visit, experiments we cannot verify continue in secret, chasing transmutations we're told are impossible, sometimes at a cost measured in human lives. The rain falls tonight on Prague, on Vienna, on London, and Paris. It drums against the rooftops of buildings that once housed laboratories where alchemists hunched over their furnaces, breathing fumes that slowly poisoned them, chasing a dream they could never quite articulate to the authorities who watched them with suspicion. The laboratories are empty now. The furnaces are cold. But the questions remain, suspended in the air like vapor from a retort, never quite condensing into answers. In the vaults of the Vatican, in the restricted collections of Oxford and Cambridge, in private libraries across Europe, there are manuscripts that have never been fully translated. Not because we lack the linguistic skills, but because the alchemists wrote in layers of meaning, in codes within codes, in symbols that shift their significance depending on context. A lion devouring the sun, a king and queen dissolving in mercury, a dragon eating its own tail. We have cataloged these images, analyzed their recurrence across centuries, but we cannot say with certainty what knowledge, if any, they were meant to preserve. Some scholars have devoted entire careers to a single alchemical text, only to conclude that it might be deliberate obscuration, a test to identify the worthy, or perhaps the ramblings of minds damaged by mercury and lead. But this explanation feels too simple, too convenient. It does not account for the patterns, for the way certain procedures appear again and again, described in different symbolic languages, but following the same essential steps. Why would brilliant minds, people who made genuine contributions to medicine and metallurgy, wrap their knowledge in such impenetrable mystery? The standard answer is that they feared persecution, that they needed to hide their work from church authorities and greedy monarchs. But some of the most elaborate encoded texts were written by alchemists who enjoyed royal patronage, who worked openly in their laboratories. They were hiding something, yes, but perhaps not from the authorities. Perhaps from those they deemed unprepared. There is a manuscript in the British Library, written in the late 1600s, that describes a process for creating the Philosopher's Stone. The instructions seem clear enough at first, a sequence of heating and cooling, of combining substances in specific proportions. But embedded in the text are warnings, strange asides that suggest the author believed the work required not just chemical knowledge, but a transformation of the alchemist himself. The impure cannot purify, it reads. The divided cannot unite. What does this mean? Is it metaphor, mysticism, or did they believe that human consciousness somehow affected the chemical reactions? Modern chemistry emerged from alchemy? This much is undeniable. Robert Boyle, who defined the modern concept of an element, was also an alchemist who believed in transmutation. Isaac Newton spent more time on alchemical experiments than on the physics that made him famous. When we excavated the soil around Newton's laboratory, we found it contaminated with mercury, at levels that suggest he was conducting the very experiments described in the ancient texts. He failed, as far as we know, but he never stopped believing. This is the haunting center of the mystery. Why did they persist? These were not fools or fantasists. They were the greatest minds of their generations, people who could calculate the motions of planets and understand the properties of light. Yet they returned again and again to their furnaces, to their crucibles glowing red in the darkness, convinced that one more experiment, one more refinement of their technique, would unlock the secret. Perhaps they did discover something. Not the philosopher's stone of legend, not immortality or infinite gold, but something stranger, harder to categorize. There are accounts, dismissed by historians as exaggerations, of alchemists producing small amounts of gold that baffled contemporary metallurgists. There are descriptions of substances with properties that did not fit the understanding of the time. Were these frauds, mistakes in observation, or glimpses of chemistry that would not be understood for centuries? The question lingers in every university where chemistry is taught, in every laboratory where elements are combined and transformed. We stand on the shoulders of the alchemists, using their techniques even as we mock their goals. Distillation, crystallization, sublimation, these are all alchemical procedures, refined and systematized, but essentially unchanged. We have abandoned the symbolism, stripped away the spiritual language, but the work continues. And in quiet moments, some chemists wonder. The creation of new elements in particle accelerators, the transformation of one substance into another at the atomic level, these are transmutations that would have amazed the alchemists. We have achieved what they dreamed of, but through methods they could never have imagined. Does this mean they were right to search, even if they looked in the wrong place? Or does it simply prove that the human desire to transform matter, to control the fundamental building blocks of reality, runs deeper than any particular scientific paradigm? The rain falls on abandoned spaces, soaking into soil still contaminated by their experiments. In Basel, in Erfurt, in Krakow, there are buildings marked by faded symbols, places where alchemists worked in secrecy and died without revealing what they believed they had learned. Their ashes were scattered, their notes were burned or encoded beyond recovery, and their secrets, if there were secrets, dissolved into history like salt into water. But the question remains, whispered in the halls of universities, debated in the margins of academic papers, lingering in the back of the mind when a chemist observes an unexpected reaction. Was the philosopher's stone a metaphor for spiritual transformation, a symbolic way of describing psychological change? Or was it something else, something that existed in the intersection between matter and mind, in a realm of understanding we have not yet mapped? The alchemists cannot answer. The rain falls on their empty laboratories, and the silence is absolute, and we are left to wonder whether we are still searching for what they sought, under different names, with different tools, chasing the same impossible dream of transformation that has haunted humanity since we first learned to kindle fire and melt metal from stone. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.